Okay, we are running a little bit out of seats, so I'm going to ask non-committee members if you could take a seat over here. Sharon, we have a seat for you at the table.
Oh, okay, thanks. You know, I still like to do the.
Really? Okay, I'll go down. Yep.
Great, thank you.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. We're just a little bit late. Mr. Evans is on the phone. Good morning, Bill.
Hi, Amy.
Hey, did you get the emails that were just emailed to you?
Good, thanks.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. And just for the record, we'll start by going around the room. Ms. Johnston, can you start?
Jennifer Johnston.
Dennis Wheeler, counsel to the committee.
Erica McConnell, Crime Planning.
Tyler Robinson, Planning and Zoning.
Robin Ward, Real Estate.
Sharon Walsh, Development Services.
Pete Peterson, committee member.
What Hall?
Amy DeBoski?
Carol Long, Lone Ridge Planning.
Chris Schutte, Director of Economic and Community Development.
All right, with that, now we're just going to go around the outside of the room because we have some people here. We wanted to see who's in the audience. Let me start.
Heather Nolan, resident. Teresa Arnold, resident. Devin Kelly, AD. Becky Winperson, in-house counsel for GCI. Erin Elam, Equipment Incorporated.
Or B, resident.
Annette Cartier, resident.
Lance Powell.
Resident.
Yeah.
Kathy Gleason, Trinity resident.
All right, with that, everybody got a copy of the agenda for this morning. Really, the big thing on the agenda is the drop cell tower ordinance, which I'm so excited to see. Are there any comments from members or modifications of the agenda? All right, seeing none, we'll just start right away with the drop cell tower ordinance, and I will turn it over to the committee.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Glad to see everyone here again this morning. And we've got the draft that Mr. Wheeler has printed out and made available to us. And I think we'll just
Sure.
allow him to go through and tell us what he's done.
So by way of updating the full committee, we've been kicking around some different ideas. Some of them we'll definitely need feedback from the committee as to where you want to go before this draft is ready for any more formal activity. But the basic concept became trying to reorganize the code so it tended to flow more like what the process looks like, right? So you start with whether or not you're subject to the code, what are the definitions, how do you apply, what's the notice process, what are the standards, what's the pathway to getting your permits or your approvals. So we've been working on trying to get the reorg set up, and then inside of that, deciding whether there's old code provisions that should come out, what sort of new code should come in, with some emphasis on trying to figure out how to incentivize what we would call stealth towers. Where can we streamline the process? Where can we best address neighborhood concerns? How do we take into account federal standards? And with that, we then decided it might be helpful to try to do some sort of flow chart work. So I came up with a draft flow chart as a starting point. That's this diagram here with the arrows. It's going to need some more tweaking as we develop the code. Of course, we'll change this, and then in theory, you could drill down inside of this to see where some of these notice requirements take you, for example, or where the approval process takes you. In addition, I tried to capture what tower height might look like, and there's a couple of decision points in here to address, particularly our current co-location standards as compared with the FCC changes and how those might work together or work in addition to each other, sort of like the notion of whether they're concurrent or consecutive in terms of adding height. So that's an area of conversation to be had. Then there's one more page, which is just a sort of a rough Excel spreadsheet. it takes the current standards for each zoning district and tells you whether or not, under current code, you need a conditional use, you're permitted by right, or you have an administrative site plan approval to go through. And so I made no changes there except on the, what I'd call the back side, which is to the far right, it'll say designated view sheds. There's been a conversation about whether or not we should look at designating certain view sheds whose high aesthetic value in terms of scenery and so forth is such that we would not want towers to go into those view sheds unless they were perhaps stealth towers that would blend in with the backdrop. Wouldn't be too tall as to substantially alter the view of significant areas. I think it was Juno we were talking about. They have something like this for views of Mendenhall Glacier, for example, because it's such a high priority attraction for tourism that you would not want to clutter that scene with towers. And so we haven't actually identified any particular view sheds, but just wanted to put the notion on the table to see if there was a conversation to be had about how we would identify view sheds and what those might look like, how big would they be, what standards would apply.
Sure.
That's a pretty significant conversation in and of itself. But I just sort of captured a placeholder to
Well,
have a way to talk about it.
immediately in my mind, when I'm thinking of that, I'm thinking of like the drive to Birdwood, you know, those kind of things. Is that what you were thinking, envisioning when you?
Well, that's certainly come up. There was a proposal to put a tower in Portage right at the, kind of right where the highway turns around, and the commission did end up declining or not allowing that conditional use, and that was a principal reason. I mean, there was also issues of could it be located in other places, but the view shed was a significant factor in their decision.
And the current code right now is silent on view shed?
Correct.
But there was enough flexibility to deny it.
Sure.
And that was one of the rationales. By putting it where it was that it was in view for an extreme
Every
length
day.
of time, as you kind of hit it. It wasn't like you would deny anything within that corridor.
Ready?
I'm sure this is someplace in front of me here, but the one thing I'm kind of curious about on this sheet here, we've got the zoning, and we got type 1, 2, 3, and 4. What is the type 1, 2, 3, and 4? How does that relate back over here?
Sure, it's not in this.
Yeah.
It's not in this chart here in terms of what those are, but if you look at basically page 2 and 3 of the current draft of the ordinance, it talks about the definitions for those towers.
Okay.
Type 1 is your monopole, if you will. Type 2 is more of your lattice tower.
Okay.
Type 3 is guide wire. And Type 4 right now is a sort of a placeholder, if you will, for two concepts. One being, how can we better use utility poles versus putting up more towers? And then concept number 2 is stealth technology. The idea being that type 4, if you're using either of those two types of structure, how do you move companies in that direction? How do you provide incentives so that they will use the utility pole over adding a new tower? How will they use stealth versus a traditional tower structure? Right now, all we really do is provide a different process, right? So they would normally go through, if they're not by right, they would normally go through an admin site plan review versus a conditional use. So it's easier in terms of process, in theory, faster, in theory, cheaper. But is that enough? Is that enough to make them choose that if there's significant cost differences or significant performance differences between using these methods over traditional technology? So that's where we looked at people like Becky and her counterparts to advise us as to what the industry is. What triggers are they looking for? What would trigger them to do something that's more expensive? How do we put that in code? Make it something that they can use or will use.
Thank you.
Tyler?
Dennis, in your review, are there communities that just flat out require stealth towers in certain areas?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
That doesn't mean there aren't any. But I don't know there.
In Flagstaff, they look like pine trees.
Right, and we we have in our materials pictures of different examples. And there's a company that's pretty well known for doing some of the technology, and I think somebody got some feedback from them about cold weather and wind up here.
It's stealth concealment.
Yeah.
And she said their towers, their concealments are not prone to failure. They gear them to the codes and are required by a certain community.
They're developed and built based on engineering requirements for the location they'll be located at.
Thanks. Dennis?
So, what we could, a couple ways to do this, we could do a quick beginning to end overview and see whether that prompts conversation.
I think that's fine.
All right.
Go ahead.
And again, this is a working draft, so there's going to be rough spots. So I don't want anybody to get too concerned. This is close to final in that sense, and I'm certainly open to feedback. At the beginning of, we'll start on page 2 at the top. We've talked about, one, the exceptions, and that's basically current code in terms of required exemptions for amateur radio stations, personal antenna use, localized utility antenna. We did talk about what, even though they may be exempt, how far does that exemption go? Right now, we've said, well, if there's an abandonment, we want that addressed pretty quickly. We don't want an abandoned structure to remain too long. It should be repurposed or taken down. And then we did have a conversation about interference. If these things simply need a building permit, but they do trigger interference, should there be some mechanism in place for dealing with that? Right now, we've talked about the fact that the community doesn't really have the technical ability to step into trying to resolve interference issues. There was some language in current code about requiring the operator to resolve the problem in a certain time frame. We think that should be something that happens between the operator and the person that's alleging interference. So what we're talking about doing is simply having a requirement that when they activate a tower, they provide notice so that people within a certain range have notice that there's a newly activated tower. So if they're having issues, they can go, oh, well, maybe it's the tower, and they can have that conversation and decide what their recourse and remedies are in the private sector. Stepping on, again, I mentioned Type 4 towers, utility poles, and stealth. We're adding a definition of what is a concealed facility, the stealth technology, trying to mirror what we've seen in model code or in the FCC standards. The utility pole conversation, we haven't really come to any particular conclusion or consensus. I think while we do want to encourage their use, we're not quite sure how best to do that. We've had some ideas, like Becky had some ideas about how high you could go, whether you take into account the pathway of the utility pole. So if you look at from one end to the other, whether there's, if there were, say, for example, a significant dip between poles, you have one in the middle that's much lower, maybe you could go higher because the visual effect isn't going to be much different than what's already there, versus taking a straight line approach to poles and saying, hey, you're going to go up to a certain height. Beyond that, that would make it really stand out. We talked about whether the equipment needed to operate that antenna could be located further away from the poles to provide more shelter or better visual effects. And so we talked about what's a range, and we haven't really necessarily settled on what we should do with those. Becky, I don't know if you have any comments on that you want to add.
Sure. I mean, I think two points. The one, the comment about the height of any tower in a right-of-way was based on the federal standard that applies for certain NEPA SHPO exemptions. There's a federal standard that exempts certain power pole extension construction from those types of federal permitting review if the tower is within a certain range of other towers or other towers in the same right-of-way. That same idea that what Dennis explained, and so I was just sort of suggesting that that might be a model that would be analogous that we might think about applying in a local permitting context. Regarding the base station facilities, I had some conversations with our technical folks about the distance question. It is possible technically to put a base station a distance from a tower, you start to run into questions because of the fact that our ground freezes you. It's challenging to lay the fiber under the ground to the base station. We usually do an ice bridge, which goes sort of above ground from the tower to the base station structure, and becomes more complicated the further away it is. The few that we have in Anchorage, the base station is located in the same right of way and is about the same size as a power cabinet. That's also, so another structure that would be commonly located in a right of way. And did send some pictures to the subcommittee for their enjoyment.
Okay.
Ms. Johnson?
This is kind of an off-the-wall thought, but when you're looking at utility poles, have you taken into consideration the whole undergrounding ordinance and how that would?
We haven't really talked about that at all, I don't recall.
No, we haven't.
Well, right now, as I understand the way that it works, if you underground, let's say a company has a utility structure and they come off that structure, it's usually the last person on that structure is responsible for that structure going forward, right? So if you're undergrounding electrical service and you have a pole with an antenna on it, I believe that pole then becomes the property in some way or another, or the responsibility of whoever's remaining on that pole.
But then you've negated the point of the undergrounding process.
But yeah, it's just that, and then when you're saying the off-site utility box, so you're not saying that you really want one that's further off-site. It would be probably better for the public good and for your purposes, not to keep everything within the easement, right?
Yeah, it becomes exponentially more difficult the further it is. And again, I think it's about the same size as a utility cabinet, that is the same kind of infrastructure that would be there already, so that it's not any more intrusive than.
So in this discussion, is this a discussion on who gets the closest box?
Well, I think we're worried, like, we don't want any cabinets to block the sidewalk, for instance.
Yeah.
So that would need to be made clear, that you can't stick your cabinet into the sidewalk if it's blocking the, clear
Maybe with bike
path
jump.
or something, with a bike jump. So I think those are our concerns about making sure that it's not disrupting other functions of the right-of-way.
One additional thing I think we talked about is if they do put a antenna on an existing power pole, does that all of a sudden become a cell tower? Or is it still a power pole? Or what are we going to classify it?
Well, that seems like a question, Tyler, that we need to answer to.
Are streetlights a possibility? Are they too low? I mean, do they fall in the definition of a utility pole?
They would certainly fall in the definition of a
A
utility pole.
streetlight is a utility pole.
Yeah. Under the proposal, because we actually didn't have a definition of utility pole in our code, but I threw one in the back here. And,
Do you want to
Yep.
keep plugging along and we can
Yes.
stick to it?
So we turn the page 4, talks about qualifications for type 4 tower structures. This needs some work and let's figure out where best to place it. But the idea is here, as I understand it, is once a company gets a certain design approved as a type 4, then they don't have to come back in and get the design itself reapproved and reapproved, right? It's sort of the notion that once you have that design nailed down, then it's just a question of, are you putting it in the right location? Are there the other conditions that might trigger? But the design itself is, so if for example, they have a stealth design that we say, hey, that's a great looking tree, then we would want them to use that tree over and over and over again, rather than come back to us and say, is this tree still okay?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Is that sort of a
Go ahead, Tyler.
There's
rough way to
still
measure?
locational criteria, though. I mean,
Yes.
having a tree works in certain areas. There's no trees anywhere around, and it's just sort of plunked down.
Well, if it were subject to an administrative site plan or conditional use, then yeah, you would still have criteria. You could.
But I believe type 4 are proposed to be by right
They could be they're currently by right.
Yeah,
in
everywhere.
A lot of places, so.
The tree would have to meet the setbacks.
Yeah.
But there would be no departmental or commission review about what lot, where on the lot, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Tyler?
One last question on the tower. Does this mesh well with state statute? I'm just thinking of some of the towers, the lighting pole structures, if there would be an opportunity to put something up on a state right away. If we look into that.
There were comments about how receptive the state is to co-location, and you can probably speak to that best, Becky.
Yeah, operationally, we've not had any success with them agreeing to it. It's a great idea, especially those really tall light stanchions in the south side of town. I would
Yeah.
provide them as an opportunity, but we've had no luck with the state being amenable to those.
But there's nothing with our code, or, I mean, it's taken into consideration as we're writing our code, that if the state does change their mind, we would be.
I don't see any conflict in the code specifically with it. Again, I think our issue has been purely operational.
Yeah, and it's too bad too, because if you look at some of the pictures that we have, a lot of those tennis structures on the light poles, you really, they wouldn't catch your eye.
Might catch wind, but not your eye.
Well, and I don't even think the wind's that much of an issue for the way they're building them.
Well, that might be an idea worth filing away, because there are a number of state-financed capital projects that ultimately become the responsibility of the municipality to fund operation of. And if that is the case, then why wouldn't we push to allow co-location on those capital investments?
Yeah, use Tora for,
Yeah.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that'd be great, I think.
You may have to address that in a height issue, because I think those things are 200 feet tall.
But that's,
And
so that was my basic question. Would
Yeah,
they fit?
there's no underlying district.
Oh, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it would be great
that
if
would
we
allow
could
us.
get
We would
out
have to
Right.
talk about that.
Well,
that-
it's a
yeah.
question with respect to the light pole. You know, typically with the utility lines, you're looking at being above the utility lines, right? But on a light pole, does it matter?
For height?
Right, I mean, if you were to say, when it comes to an existing light pole, if you're gonna add an antenna structure that doesn't add to the height, why not allow it?
But the height would still be above.
Even if the light pole itself is above the standard that we would
Right.
have,
Yeah.
if it was just purely a tower,
I'm just saying,
why not
are we
allow it?
addressing that in code to clarify that?
We certainly could.
I think we would need to,
Yeah.
yeah. I don't, right.
Yeah, we certainly could do it, we don't do it yet.
Yeah, that was my point.
Okay, let's see here. Most of the submittal information in the process through pages 5, 6, and 7 is generally the same. I don't think there's any too dramatic in there that we need to spend time on now, because we have so much else to cover. If you turn to page 8, talk about notice. There's various different types of notice. There's different distances that are involved in notice. There's different methods of notice. We were thinking about trying to consolidate this. One of the easiest ways is just to refer back to the notice provisions that are already in code earlier in chapter 3, because they define how notice is done and who does it, who pays for it, and you have publishing right through our website. You have posting on the site itself. You have some sort of mailed notice to property owners within a certain distance.
And residents.
And yes, and residents. So the question is, is there anything there that we want to tweak? Does notice need to be greater than 500, less than 500? What's the timing of notice? Do you do it both at the front end, when you start the application? Do you need to do something at the back end when the application is granted or denied?
And also, one of the things that's strange about the current code is that when a tower is permitted by right, we still provide notice, and then there's an ability to appeal the issuance of a building permit, which is unusual. And so do we want to say, oh, well, this is by right, but people still get to comment? If we want people to have a comment opportunity, shouldn't it just be an administrative site plan review? And if it's by right, it's by right, and it goes the same way as other by right uses. So that's that's an odd wrinkle in this that I think at least we should talk about.
Sure. That doesn't, that to me begs that if you're gonna do the notice portion, you should do it with the application. That way people could get their, if it's an administrative site plan review or something, they could get their comments in before the decision's made. And that could be factored in with the decision being made. That makes way more sense to me. I mean, I'm just one voice, but I would rather have people have the opportunity, rather than this is a done deal, here's the decision, and then try to overturn with an appeal or something. I think it makes more sense to have all the facts in front of you and everybody's comments, and then if it's the director making the decision, he has all of those comments and facts in front of him. That's just my thought. Any other comments? Tyler?
So there are no other by right uses that get a notice? This is the only one in our code?
Yeah.
I mean, if it's by right, it ought to be by right.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's, unless there's, I know people are concerned about, potential health impacts of, I know it's been disproven, but it still comes up all the time, or I don't know if it's been disproven, but, is that a reason to provide the notice versus a land use
No,
standpoint?
we can't go there.
Okay, just the land use side.
And we,
By right land use, it ought to be, I don't see the point of a notice.
and we still have the interference notice. So it's not like they won't have an opportunity to know that it happened. So I think the question is, do we want these things to be by right, or do we want them to have some sort of higher process for review, which allows notice and comment?
Sharon, did you?
Oh, I was just gonna say, there are some notice provisions in the on-site code for, well and septic at certain distances from a lot line. So there are a few
They're not
times you
Title
require
21
notice,
stuff,
yeah.
Okay, interesting.
The other thing I notice is timing. There's a provision in here that requires a notice to go out, and the director cannot take action. The notice has to give time to property owners and the community councils a chance to comment, but you end up, the question is whether the timing's right, because you've got this gap where you gotta give at least 35 days notice, but the director has to make a decision within 50 days. So is that working okay? Where the director basically has 2 weeks to absorb whatever comments come in, assuming they don't come in at the last moment, and then 2 weeks to turn it around. So I think it's all right, but I don't know that whether there's been any experiences where that's been too compressed.
Well, and we don't have very many situations where we have that kind of notice, so, and certainly our site plan, our administrative site plan process is set up in such a way as to address, timelines where we have 60 days for the whole process. So submit an your application's complete, and then a decision has to be done in 60 days, and that includes notice and comment.
I don't know that it matters for, can't speak to the admin site plan review, but where it has to do with a conditional use and it goes to the commission, as long as the timing is such that it gets into the staff packet and isn't laid on the table at the meeting, that's, similar concerns, but the worst thing is that we get a stack of things. And I recognize comments can come in late, but at least when they come in within the time frame that be the right amount to get into the packet.
So it sounds like what we'll probably do then is set this up so the notice provisions are essentially those that are already in code in Chapter 3. And if somebody has some strong desire to make it different, we can address that if it comes up. But it would help streamline this, I think, and make it a little bit easier for people to understand.
From a holistic perspective, the more continuity we can create in code, probably the better. Just a basic observation. Mr. Evans, do you have any questions or comments?
No, I'm good, thanks.
All right.
All right, the next one's at the bottom of that page, page 8. There was a provision allowing the director to modify requirements, and one of those was with respect to height. So we toyed with what should the separation distance be, and what authority should the director have in terms of changing these provisions. So I've been throwing numbers out there to see what sort of reaction I get, and my latest throw out is the bottom 5B1, the minimum separation distance from a protected use, I guess we'll call them, is 150% of the height. The director or the approving authority could reduce that, but no less than 110% of the allowable height. So it builds in some flexibility to take in special circumstances. Right now, it's, what, 200%? So the question is 200% too much? Should we do something less than that? If so, how does that coincide with the authority's ability to adjust it? And then that conversation spawned some discussion with Becky about what Juneau has done, where they don't look necessarily at the total tower height, but they actually look at this feature called, is it called breakaway? Breakpoint technology, where the tower is engineered so it's designed that if it's going to break at this one point, and that point drives your height or your separation distance issues. And I have not incorporated that in here, but wanted to point it out to the committee that that's a conversation that's being had.
Well, that kind of makes sense. I've never heard of that.
The overall issue is whether or not our current code is too restrictive and too greatly diminishes where towers can go, which then drives the desire to have larger towers to span those gaps. And whether this is the right approach or should be combined with this notion of trying to encourage more smaller towers using utility poles, for example, or stealth. So there's sort of got this tension, if you will, between these different options and what's the right mix.
Jennifer?
Erica, do you remember what we did with windmills? Or
It was something a little over 100%, but you couldn't, there was no reduction allowed.
I mean, that's a place to start. The breakaway technology, I mean, this is similar to what all of the lighting poles the state has. I mean, it's a pretty familiar, pretty well-tested.
Yeah, and I provided Dennis with that language as an example. I think the Juneau approach is a common sense approach that actually addresses the fall zone, what the
Right, which is
possible
what you're-
fall zone of the tower was. I think the challenge with these bigger, this bigger percentage, it starts to look an awful lot like a backdoor way of regulating RF emission exposure when we're looking at a fall zone where a tower could never possibly, tower's not going to fall 150% of its height ever, and never going to fall 200% of its height either.
So the committee needs to take, I mean, the policy question is what are you legislating? Are you legislating the fall zone, or are you legislating others?
There's, I think he's probably going to speak to us, but there are two other issues that get mixed in here, and that is not so much the tower, but there's some concern about the antenna and how far do they go if they do rip off. And then two, is this the right way to address aesthetics by creating greater separation between the tower structure and these protected uses? If that were a driving factor, I'm not sure that it is, and it may be that aesthetics are better addressed elsewhere. For example, these view shed notions, but it's not necessarily just the tower height itself, but also involves the structures that are on that tower.
And I was just going to sort of follow up on that I don't think the separation distance was just for a fall situation, because I think people who wrote the code when this was here know that a tower can't fall 200% of its height. So I think there were other issues that it was trying to address, kind of a comfort level for something that is very tall near these protected uses. So it's not just about the potential for falling down.
Okay,
Dennis, to speak to your point real quick, and I haven't read the Juneau example, but other jurisdictions that do have height limitations set on breakpoints include for the maximum height calculation, include the antennas. So if you've got a pole structure, then you have an antenna that actually reaches the maximum height. That won't count. So they set their maximum heights not at the maximum height of the pole structure, but at the maximum height of anything extending off of the pole structure.
That's how we measure height as well.
And just for clarity, I'll get to you in just a second, Sharon. We have a lot to get through today, so if you have questions or comments, I ask you to write them down, and then we'll take public comments at the end.
If she talks, we can.
I was gonna say, I'm running the meeting, so this is how I'm running it.
I
Sharon.
was just saying, and this is a nerdy engineer comment, it's conceivable if I'm a tower and I came loose and I fell, I could bounce. So,
Oh, that's true. And, My comments about that, if somebody asks you a question from the committee, you're more than welcome to answer. Okay, so Becky's been asked questions, so I'm letting her answer. Sorry. All right, go ahead.
Okay, the next, there's a couple of placeholders here for landscaping and fencing, some general standards. We haven't fleshed those out yet. I don't think they're going to be too hard to work with, so I'm going to skip over those, but just note them for the record. I do want to talk about co-location because that's a hot button item. It starts at the bottom of page 10, it goes into page 11, and this is where it's helpful to have this little chart handy, this little tower drawing that I did, my cone tower. So right now, on the left side of this drawing of the tower, you have these two co-located antenna, add 15 feet, add 15 feet. That's the way I read our co-location code as it currently stands. You can get up to 30 feet additional if you're doing co-location. 15 per antenna for a max of 30 feet. The FCC rule, I tried to write backwards here because of the way it's worded. The FCC rule allows modifications. And if those modifications are substantial, then the city has a pretty significant role to play. But if they're not substantial, then they pretty much go right through. There's, you're not allowed to tinker with those or hold them up. So I tried to say, well, what is unsubstantial for purposes of tower height? And this is my first stab at trying to make it readable in a little graphic. So if your change is adding less than 10% of the tower height, or it's one antenna that's less than 20 feet of separation, whichever of those two is greater, that's your additional height. So if your tower is 100, you could go to just under 110 and be okay. Or if you're adding this 19-foot antenna array separation, you can get that distance. That's sort of a rough way of explaining that. Am I pretty close, Becky?
Yeah, basically it's 10% or 20 feet, whichever is greater.
Yeah. So right now, the way I would read their rule and our rules, they would be, you don't add one on top of the other because we haven't really addressed this clearly. I would say that right now, if I were required to interpret the two of them, you could get our allowances up to 30 feet. The FCC would say you would pass through their application without any real hurdles if they're under this 20-foot requirement on a 100-foot tower. So it's not that it's 30 plus another 20. It's that they're sort of co-equal, or they happen kind of concurrently, right? You have to mesh the two together and see which pathway do you go on. Is that what we want to do? I think one way or another you do need to address this federal rule and make a decision. Some jurisdictions copy it in wholesale, some just incorporate it by reference, but they all try to identify what is it that we want in an application so we can judge whether it fits or doesn't fit, and how are we going to handle the process. So if they're under the requirements, we don't hold them up and get ourselves sideways with the federal requirements.
Sure. Erica,
So-
did you have a comment?
Well, I can follow up with Dennis afterwards, but I'm just curious to see how he interprets the federal rules that if we've allowed co-location at the start of the tower, that 5 years later they can't come back and apply the 6409, say, oh, we're putting another antenna on and we wanted our 10% or 20 feet. But we can discuss that.
So what I did for right now is starting at page 13 near the bottom, line 42. I put a placeholder there, and I just copied in, below that I just copied in the federal text. Okay, they had an A section that's just sort of an overview. I've got B, the definitions all the way through. Page 13, 14, 15, 16. That's all just the federal text. So anybody can kind of look through it and see what they're saying and how they apply it. I think if we have some policy guidance on how you want it to mesh with our current co-location code, or whether you want it to be in some way a replacement for, then I can figure out how best to incorporate it, whether to incorporate it by reference or drop it in wholesale.
Any comments, Mr. Evans?
No, ma'am.
Okay, are there any thoughts? We're gonna have to come up with some sort of recommendation for Dennis to kind of go back and rework this, so we need committee members to start weighing in on this question. Chris, do you have any comments?
No, it's kind of a tricky one.
Yeah, and I would note that Becky's given us some guidance that was provided by, Becky, who did this?
PCIA model ordinance?
Yeah. And did they do the guidelines too?
Yep.
Yeah, so we do have some material that's in the file about what her association looks at in terms of how to, as a model, implement it.
Who did that?
It's a working group of industry representatives and I believe the National Municipal League representatives and in the wake of the 6409A legislation to attempt to interpret it and implement it into a model ordinance for use in municipalities. So it's a model ordinance provision and then also a checklist for how to look at applications for co-location under 6409.
So the question would be, in their ideal world in the model code, how do they see an original structure? How do they see an original structure that has some co-located facilities that's more than one antenna array owned by more than one operator perhaps? And how many times then do you get to exercise this federal modification, right? Once.
Once under federal law. Yeah.
Right. So how do they, if you've already got a co-located facility for one, how does that work? Would be the question. If-
So
yeah.
my understanding of the federal law is that you, if you may already have multiple carriers on the tower, and if you want to add height to get another carrier, then you can come back one time under the federal regulation and have an as-of-right, essentially, extension that does not exceed 10% or 20 feet. And the idea of that is to, in the instance where a tower is too short, allow a secondary option to extend it. We've talked extensively in the subcommittee about the technical feasibility or lack thereof of this as really a realistic option, and the fact that if co-location is desired, it's better to build it in up front with an extension in height to allow a tower to actually be engineered and constructed to support multiple carriers, because there are a lot of feasibility issues with this idea that you could later come on and stick on an extension. But what the federal plan does contemplate is that you could come back later and ask for that extension to allow another carrier on the existing tower.
So under,
Well, you were gonna find some information about whether you actually can find a company that does extensions that you could just kind of stick on top of.
Yeah, and actually I might defer to Nick, who just came in, who is who knows these operational answers, and I've spoken to him about it a bit. I don't know if you want to address that answer.
Going forward, what the industry's doing when they're ordering poles is, if you go look at the one on Northern Lights, I think it's by the Mexican restaurant, I can't remember the name of it.
Northern
If you
Lights
look
on Lake
on top
Otis.
of it, yeah, there's a flange on top of it. That pole was pre-designed to have an extension put on top of it. So you can order a 10-foot or 20-foot extension and bolt a flange on top of it. So we've made the decision internally that that's what we'll start doing as well. The older towers, they do make a sleeve type of insert that you can insert on top of the pole. That's the easy part. The hard part is making sure the rest of the pole and the foundation can support it. And there are design options where you might have to weld 3x3 angle iron up the side of the pole. If you look really closely at some poles, you'll see some weird stuff on the outside of them, and that's what they've had to do. You know, the poles that were built 10, 15, 20 years ago were contemplating all of these antennas, all these carriers, so they have to be re-engineered and modifications have to be made. So, you know, for the newer type poles, it's fairly easy. For the older type poles, it's, you know, quite extensive work. But it is done, and we do it.
And an idea that Robin and I had was to encourage co-location and enable it was to require all new towers to be engineered to support 3 antenna arrays, whether or not those are planned from day one. So that if they're not, and they just have one, the pole's already engineered to support the addition of co-located antennas up on the top. So it was just an idea for discussion.
And we've been doing that for probably the last 5 to 7
Great.
years, but it was contemplated that they would go lower. So the big change is having the flange on top where the carrier could actually go higher. So that was the major change, was the flange modification.
So-
Any new poles we order will be like that.
Becky, would you say that the way our code is currently structured, if I install a tower and have more than one antenna array on that, under our co-location provision, under the federal rule, you'd get one more?
Make sure I'm understanding your question.
Right.
So, if I install a tower, I apply for it, and I get my ounce of right height, and then an additional 15 feet for the other carriers going to be on the tower.
At the initial installation?
Yeah. And then later, 2 or 3 years later, there's a third carrier who says, I want to be on your tower, then under the federal regulations, I get to come back and ask for that extension.
Right.
And it must be approved in order to allow that extension, and that's where the tower construction comes
Right.
in.
So, but let's say I build my tower and I have not taken advantage of the city's co-location provision. 2 years later, I do.
I don't think you can do that. Can you? I don't. They have. Can you? I don't see in the current code the opportunity to come back later and ask for 30 feet more of as of right. That's an interesting question. If you.
Because then the question is,
You get it
do you
again.
get one more federal, or is that your federal? Right, so we want to make sure we understood that.
think
Well, I
they
think
just
And
pick
if you
one.
have two co-locations with your original tower, so you have 3 antennas, can you use your federal thing to come back for a fourth in 2 years, or 5 years, or whatever?
Yeah, so you get up to 115 feet in a residential area, if you do the math.
Potentially, yeah, you could get, depending on how you read this, so we'd want to make sure that,
Well, I think we need to keep it simple, and the fact of the matter is, we know this federal gimme is out there. I don't know what you want to call it, but if somebody chooses to co-locate from the beginning, obviously they're going to get a higher tower, right? So I think the decision's made at the beginning. I don't think they should keep coming back and getting another bite of the apple time and time again. How do we deal with that?
But we can't
'Cause there's
preempt the federal rule, so they always get that one opportunity to come back and
Can you though, Dennis, can you craft something where contingent upon them accepting co-location in the beginning, they forfeit their right to federal extension?
I'm
I
not sure.
think that violates federal law.
Oh, come on.
So you
Don't
can,
blame me.
well, I mean, the problem is then
Trying to problem
you're,
solve here.
it's self-defeating, right? Because you want them to co-locate at the
Well, we
beginning.
do, but we don't want 250 foot towers.
That's
Although I
right.
do think that, so to a certain degree, this is a lot of kerfuffle about something that is, the potential for this is relatively minimal. I mean, ideally, a tower is constructed from the get-go to support the number of carriers that are going to exist on it. Right now, we have max 3 carriers anywhere in the state of Alaska, and we're not a state that has 6 or 7 carriers looking at a tower. And it is challenging to extend them even, despite the advances in technology that Nick talked about, it's definitely preferred to address it up front, create a tower that's going to satisfy the number of co-locations you need. And there are also sort of this interaction with the building code questions that if the building code changes over time and you've built a tower that could support 3 carriers, it can then support those carriers over time. But if there's a tower that's engineered under a current building code, and then I understand maybe the building code changes and then we're trying to add an extension, the tower isn't, I don't know, Sharon, maybe you can probably speak to this more than I can. But I wonder if there's some interplay there that would be challenging, thinking about a later extension of the tower.
No, the building code doesn't really speak to that kind of thing. It's going to be pretty straightforward. It's foundation, hold it up.
I think the concern would be that we have a scenario in code where you look at it and you go, 65 feet for residential district, that's all right. But then all of a sudden, it's actually 115 because of the way we have our co-location and the way the federal law works with that.
I did want to mention one thing. Maybe I'm not sure if I'm ahead or no. But on the appeals part, speaking of building code, this talks about if a building or land use permit is final unless, based on the requirements of this section, is final unless approved by the Planning and Zoning Commission. And I get that on this section, that's the reason, but I could see someone saying, why can't I appeal it to the building board too? I have appeal rights under the
You're
building
way
board.
ahead. Let's hold that one.
You're ahead, and actually, that's a current code, it's a current code issue that we've got to walk through.
Dennis, the way you've written it now is that it not be in addition to the 30 feet, right? You write that
Well,
the
I
additional height allowance by co-location under this subject is concurrent with and not in addition to height modifications made pursuant to FCC 64.
I've made that graphical representation,
Yeah.
but I still have to work the code side to see if we can do it and make sure we don't have Becky come and say, no, sorry, that's totally wrong. But I think that would be my sense of what the community would want. They wouldn't necessarily want 65 feet to be 115.
Right.
They do want co-location because they want fewer poles.
Right.
But that height may be too much.
You
to-
just take
to
away
stomach.
the one extra
Take
co-location,
away one-
and then they
one
get the third one, and that's the max. I mean, they get one co-location under our code, and they get the next one 20 feet instead of 15 under the FCC.
It could be, and then we may need to address whether that co-location happens up front, right, or not, or just make it clear that it's just one time regardless of when it's done, and then one federal one on top of that.
One issue when we start talking about co-location is what's required to allow that co-location up front. That's one of the things that we've talked about is an actual agreement, a contract. That's not always easy to get up front. A letter of intent might be something that's more appropriate than a full contract. You may not be able to get an actual contract, which but they could get one later. So do you allow them to come back for that one co-location, or do you make it easier to do it initially?
I would say generally, my thought is to make it a little easier initially, and it's because, I would rather have fewer towers than more towers, but I don't wanna see, ridiculous monstrosities either. And so, you're right though, it's sometimes, I've sat at my own community council meetings where we specifically asked them to make the tower bigger because we wanted co-location, but they didn't necessarily have a contract yet.
That's right.
But they made the tower bigger, they are. So you're right, we have to account for, I think Robin hit it on there. I think between between Tyler and Robin, I think those are both two very good suggestions.
The page 11, right in the middle, is a highlighted paragraph. Originally it talked about co-location and a proof in a form acceptable to a municipal attorney, that's all it said. So I added a little bit to that, and I thought about what's the purpose? The purpose is to make sure that the additional height is actually being used by additional carriers. Right?
Yep.
And if not, what are you going to do about it? Well, maybe what you're looking for at some point, this is always a timing issue because when do you have your co-location agreements actually solidified? But if it's not being used in a co-located way, then within a certain time period, that extra height has to come off.
That would give
Right,
them- that would give
and the
them
community has the
motivation.
ability to issue an abatement order if we set this up right. Is that the right way to address this issue, to make sure it's being used properly?
Go ahead, Jen.
That's one of those things.
Well,
That's one of those-
your flange, you have a flange, right? Go up there, just unbolt that flange and
That-
crane that thing down. I don't know.
That's one of those
but
things
that's-
that sound kind of good, but I can think of our last couple of years where you had 3 carriers and now a 4th one has come in.
Yeah.
Now, is our market, we're a small market, so maybe this is it for that kind of situation. But if you did that kind of approach, then you've just stated if you're coming in with another carrier, you're gonna be putting up your own towers anyway. You basically are defeating your purpose of co-location. So, I would be very leery of
The thing
unless
is-
it's something like,
With respect to this, I think the problem with it's an idea that sounds lovely, but I think operationally it would be
Yeah.
a complete disaster and it's just not really feasible and also would completely defeat the purpose of if you build a tower that, the idea is you build a tower and maybe there's an extra space and then, maybe not immediately, but later on it becomes something that
we want to
more
encourage
providers
co-location.
do. Yeah.
Right, and the question is, how do you enforce it? Because every time you put these conditions in, you're also saying, we're gonna make it a requirement, and we are going to enforce that requirement. And if so, how are you gonna do that?
Because we don't really want a situation where someone comes and says, oh yeah, so-and-so, other providers, they're thinking about my tower, and so I get 80 feet in a residential district, and no one else ever comes on that tower. And so then you've given them 15 feet extra height, and nothing ever happens.
You don't think, how many do we have like that?
We haven't allowed that.
So, what my concern is I would think the market of building a tower that can allow for co-location and encourage co-location. If I were the company to put that extra cost in there, I wouldn't do that and then not use it. I mean, I just, it worries me if we get a little too convoluted how we administer this.
Well, I think from a private sector standpoint, if I have something that can be revenue generating, I'm gonna try to generate that
Yeah.
revenue, which means lease the space.
I mean, that's
So
what I
I
said.
would think from a
Yeah.
private sector perspective, if I was running a company and I had
That's just what I was saying.
6 towers out there and I knew I had voids in those, you know, I could be generating more revenue, I would actively be searching. And I think as another person coming in, it would be cheaper to rent a space than to build their own tower and go through the process.
But the other person's a competitor.
Well, and also the height of the antenna, I mean, the different, I don't totally understand it, and I know Becky can explain it better, but the needed height of the antenna depends on the frequencies of the carrier and also the space that they're trying to cover. So if they've identified a space and they need to cover a certain area, and gosh, we need to be 80 feet to cover this area, and nobody needs to be 65 feet because that just doesn't accommodate anybody and cover any area. I mean, I'm not trying to accuse carriers of being duplicitous, but if they need that 80 feet, can they manipulate our system in order to get the 80 feet when nobody really needs the 65?
And that's a totally different, that's a totally different argument on what we're trying to, I mean.
But if you don't, if you're gonna give them the extra 15 feet for co-location without making sure that that co-location actually happens, then you're just giving them an extra 15 feet.
So I guess
And
that I would have to walk back my previous statement. The only way to really make sure, without dealing with abatement and all these other things, is basically force it on the front end. Make sure that they have a signed contract, is what I'm hearing.
And that's, yes, but we've also heard that's problematic, so that this is a conflict point.
So the question becomes, is do we make it on the front end, or would you rather us have an abatement provision in the back end? I mean, that's a choice.
Yeah, I mean,
And it sounds to me the front end's probably more palatable.
I think the front end is more palatable. I'd say a couple things. One is that there are, and we've talked about this in the subcommittee, there are some logistical challenges to having an actual signed contract for a tower because we've talked about, you know, we've seen this here in this community a number of times. You apply for a tower project, it ends up in litigation for 2 years. No one's going to sign a contract and commit that they're definitely going to co-locate on that tower when your tower then. So we have challenges with the upfront contracting. And I would say we have frequent examples in Anchorage of towers that are 65 feet tall because there's been no allowance for co-location, and now we can't extend them. Like I know that we're looking at a Rogers Park community project there, and there are several towers near that neighborhood that are all too short for co-location. And so we're in this exact situation that, I mean, the challenge is that's the situation that's created if there's no way to
And
have that.
maybe there is a point of in between here, because if you actually had a signed letter of intent versus an actual contract, I mean, that means GCI, AT&T, whomever would actually have to go to their competitor and say, they would have to evaluate. I can't imagine your competitor would sign a letter of intent just to help you out.
And I can defer to Nick's giving me the eye. I think we do have that happen in a number of communities. There are things, because it is a thing that is of interest, especially as we start to build in more residential communities and communities where extra bandwidth is needed and we don't have, it's harder to permit. Other providers are very interested in getting on tower projects in those areas. I don't know, Nick, if you have additional comments on that.
Yeah, and even though we are competitors, we have, we share pricing schedules, and we actually share our build schedules every year, and all of our existing tower locations. It saves us several $100,000 in 8 months if I can get on another tower. So even though we are competitors, we do work very closely together. I mean, we speak almost weekly. I meet with Verizon every 2 weeks on all their tower projects. They meet with me, we share the information. Because the last thing we want to do is spend that additional money and go through the process. You know, it's not a fun process to go talk to people about building towers. And so we are competitors. 10 years ago, I would totally agree with you. We would not work together at all. Now, we talk weekly or at least every other week about, hey, I'm building in this area next year. You need to improve your service. You know, are you interested? So we have those conversations all the time.
Jennifer and Erica.
So you brought up Rogers Park, and what stops you from using the FCC allotment now with those towers?
My understanding is that they're not engineered for extensions.
So it's,
they're not for you.
so it's the upfront building cost of allowing. So, and that's another way we maybe can address it, where you incentivize or if you encourage the upfront building for two bump ups, but you don't necessarily have to do it until down the line when it's necessary.
Would there be any benefit to requiring this signed lease or agreement, like at the building permit time, instead of at the application for the tower approval?
Well, I think the challenge there isn't this part of the criteria for approval, so it would be, you
Well-
would be an approval subject to later confirmation.
Yeah, it would be a condition. It would be and I think we've done that once, but it would be a condition that you have to produce this later in order to get the permission to actually build what you say you're gonna build. So that would avoid this, we're in appeals for 2 years.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question. I think that it seems to me to still make a little more sense as part of the approval process, but, and again, I'm not sure whether other tower companies would be able to, at that timing in the process, how close we are to construction, we're going through a building permit. I don't know what you think.
We would not sign a lease for a tower unless we were going to get on it within 8 months. And typically what happens is you build your tower and someone shows up 2 to 3 years later. So if you required the lease to be signed up front, we more than likely would not apply for the additional height, which just means it's not going to be co-locatable in the future. And that's a business decision. You know, it's expensive. You don't want to pay a lease for 18 months if you're not actually on the facility. They're not cheap. You know, so operationally it's a struggle to justify signing a lease that far in advance.
Why 2 to 3 years?
Because my priorities are based on my customer complaints, and I hate to say this, but I might not be able to, if I've got a couple $1 million to do improvements, and I've got 500 customers complaining over here and 100 complaining over here, and I only have enough to do over here, that's the priority. I'm gonna fix that first. And you know, it's a process that we go through where we need to do our coverage improvements. So unfortunately, it could take a couple of years to get to an area to improve the service.
Well, and I think that goes back to maybe the mitigated solution here is a letter of intent that's signed by a competitor, because it's not actually a lease. So they're not actually expending money, but they have recognized they have a deficiency in this particular area, so they want to be there. So then, you know, what I don't want to see is a neighborhood that has 2 towers where we could have done 1, frankly. So, any other comments? Mr. Evans, do you have anything?
No, other than, in my opinion, I would grant the 15, if they applied and said they were interested in co-locating down the road, I'd have no problem granting the additional 50 feet without a letter of intent or a contract. I think incentivizing co-location is important, and letting, you know, the concern that companies are going to just game the system for an additional 15 feet. So I just make it simple.
Simple is typically better. Any other?
Just one more thought is, Dennis, that you, I mean, in a way, isn't this sort of the same, thing as abandonment? So we deal with abandoned towers and the requirement for them to remove abandoned or unused towers. I hate that term, abandoned, for towers. But if you have allocated space for co-location that isn't used within, I think the time frame in code right now is 18 months or a year.
Actually, go to page 17 at the bottom. Any antenna or tower structure that is not operated for a continuous period of 12 months shall be considered abandoned. Shall remove the same within 180 days of receipt of notice from the director. And then we can go through the abatement process. So yeah, it's.
So who will be the abatement people? Code enforcement?
The difference here is that this, well, I would think so. The difference here is that this talks about either the antenna or the tower structure. It doesn't talk about portions of the tower structure.
Right, but I'm
Right,
saying,
so-
couldn't the same line of thinking be applied to portions of?
The problem, I think, would be in terms of design of the tower itself. If it were something where it's some sort of flange system that can be, in theory, unbolted, then you could do it. If it's somehow part of the original structure, then you're talking about a considerable expense and effort. I mean, when you're going to climb up there and saw off that 15 feet, you know, if it came to it, you know, so it's a question of, no, we wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah.
So it's the enforcement issue, right? You can say that you're going to wish that they would take down that extra footage, but push comes to shove, how is that going to happen?
Well, we make them do it if it's an abandoned tower. I mean, the owner has to do it.
You'd have to write that in here to make
The
sure.
owner's
that,
still
you know,
around.
Yeah, that could be a problem too,
But,
if the owner.
you know, again, you're talking about lopping off a portion of the tower, not just taking the whole thing down. And I know he's,
And the issue with the additional height that we're talking about is if I'm the owning carrier, I can mount my antennas to the top. So then you're asking me to come in and
Move yours down.
move mine down and cut 15 feet off. That's going to cause us network issues because we've engineered it in at that height. We've optimized it in at that height. So even lowering the antennas 15 to 20 feet would have a negative impact on our network. And unfortunately, we have the worst frequencies possible. Our company does for cellular coverage, and height is very important to us. So, you know, the other carriers have lower frequencies. It's not so important for them.
so the benefit of co-location comes with this burden that we haven't figured out how to deal with.
And just so you know, inherently, our biggest enforcement problems come with, oh yeah, we can do all this stuff, but you can't find the person who did the problem. Builder's gone, you know, the company went out of business. It's like, we can't, I mean, it's at the person's expense, we'll find them. And then you can actually put a lien on the property, but that expires. We don't ever get that money back, even at tax time. So down the road, we've had a lot of problems with enforcement.
Well, let's move on and get through this, and then we'll have a few times. What I think is going to end up happening, Dennis, because I can tell we're not really getting clear answers yet, is if you could draft for us a list of questions that need direction, we'll send that out to the committee members, and then at our November 4th meeting, we'll bring this back up under old business, and we'll see if we can get consensus on those specific questions that need answering. Tyler?
Can I add a couple of questions to that list that I don't
Absolutely.
think are coming up? One is, the hardest thing to evaluate at the planning commission level is the general conditional use standards. So you've got the standards for the antenna, but it also has to go back to the general conditional use. And some of those conditional use standards have to do with the whatever the application is, altering the character of the surrounding neighborhood, right? I mean, that's entirely subjective. Or consistency with the comp plan, which depending on what comp plan applies could, you know, there's all kinds of aesthetic priorities and goals in the comp plan. I don't know how to get around that stuff. That's the hard, and that might be where you're going, protecting view sheds, and maybe that's really how you get there. But it's in those areas that it's really hard to, you know, evaluate whether this application is or is not. The other thing I would say is, you know, just on Dennis's, you know, permit, and I recognize this is existing, but I frankly think providing permitted by right use of lattice towers in our business districts doesn't make sense. And, you know, I mean, I live in East End, there's one off of DeBar and Boniface that's right on the street. It doesn't make sense to have a non-monopole tower in an area where we're trying to do high-quality commercial development. So I think that ought to be questioned. It seems inappropriate. A monopole would seem much more fitting in all of our business districts.
I think that's a good discussion. Okay, Dennis, do you want to finish this up?
Sure. What other kind of controversial issue I can stir up here? Let's see. The only thing really left, I think, is as far as big ticket items, is we've talked about what the appeal process should look like. And then Sharon brought this issue about appealing the issue of a building or land use permit. Where does that go?
Yep, because.
You have one pathway where you could, in theory, go to the director for administrative site plan. You could then turn around and either reapply for conditional use if you don't get your site plan, or you appeal the denial of the site plan or the approval of the site plan. Maybe you end up going to the Planning and Zoning Commission. Maybe you then end up going to the Board of Adjustment, and then maybe after that you go to court. That's quite a lot of process for an appellate path, depending on which category you're in, and what you're really trying to accomplish. So,
Do you have recommendations?
my suggestion is to make it simpler, streamline it, but without doing harm to the right of either the company or the affected property owners to make their case. So neither one of them should have to make their case 5 times, right? A couple of times, go to court if you need to. Because it's expensive and it's time consuming and it just sucks the life out of you.
So, just so I'm clear, so when an administrative site plan review is denied, if it's appealed, it goes to planning and zoning?
Normally, if it's just if it's a non-tower situation, it would become a major site plan review in front of the Urban Design Commission. And that's similar if a short plat is denied, is appealed, whether it's approved or denied, it becomes a long plat in front of the planning board. So the way we were, that's an old code provision, the platting thing. The concept.
But on the building permit side, right now, you go to the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Yes, just for towers.
Yeah.
I think if you want to appeal a regular building permit, you go to the building board, right?
Right, and so the question
But-
is, would you have an appellant who would want to say, I want to go to the building board, it's a building permit, the building permit regulations allow me to go to the building board.
The concept that we were trying to put into the new code was that if you have if you have kind of 2 levels of review, you have your board commission review, and for things that are kind of less significant, smaller, less impacts, you have an administrative review that's kind of a 2-tiered system. Major site plan review, administrative site plan review, long plat, short plat, that if your administrative decision is appealed, it just turns into the board or commission review concept. That was what we had tried to do in those 2 particular situations, and frankly, it's what we tried to do with the beer and wine appeal, that if a beer and wine administrative decision is appealed, it just becomes a conditional use that the assembly reviews.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm clear, so administrative decisions that are appealed, it goes to the board or commission?
Well, not every single one, but we've set up that 2-tier system for a couple of different types of approvals.
Because
So site plan reviews and plats.
Right, so specifically with towers, I think it makes sense to just have one standard, I mean, honestly. Then what is that standard gonna look like? The appeal process, what is that gonna look like? Because I think picking this commission, that commission, whatever, I think that's how people selectively game the system, and I don't mean that to say that people are being, intentionally doing that, but the fact is there just needs to be one standard, and I think it creates consistency for the community and the carriers that are trying to, they know what to expect. So what's it gonna look like? Is it gonna be an appeal then to planning, turn it into a conditional use and go through the planning and zoning and then to the assembly, or just straight to the assembly? What does it look like?
Well, with respect to the assembly, it wasn't all that long ago, the assembly was the Board of Adjustment, and basically begged to get out of that business. Because that's
Well, there's certain things we chose to keep, like alcohol, for example.
Right.
Those things we chose to take.
Right.
So that's the question, is with cell towers, they're very controversial.
Right.
But when people get very upset, we had a power substation in my neighborhood
Right.
that it never went to the assembly, and I personally think that's something that should have gone to the assembly because it was a major, major project. And so I think the assembly years ago gave away more than they should have personally. And I've seen it from the impacts, because when I have, 500 people calling me and I literally had no say in the matter, I think that's a problem.
And then keep in mind, you yourself had a a relevant experience with the assessment district, Eberhard matter,
Yeah.
right? So it took a significant amount of time and
But we did a
effort.
great job.
You did a great job, but it is a huge commitment, and keep in mind that it can affect your ability to
To
engage
govern.
with your constituents, because you may end up in ethical or conflict of interest situations where, yeah, your legislative hat says you can spend all day talking to these people, but now you're an adjudicator, you gotta stand back, and all you can really focus on is what's presented to you in the forum. So, I'm not saying you can't do it, I'm just saying there's pros and cons to doing it.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, we've been through it now twice, so.
Yeah. So again, I haven't really toyed with this too much, I just sort of noted here are some issues. I do think you need to streamline the appeal process so that there's some certainty.
Okay. Well, that was a good introduction to the topic. What I'll ask you to do again, Dennis, is just retool the questions that you presented. So they're in English and not lawyer speak. And we'll just disseminate them to everyone, and then we'll come back on November 4th under old business, and we will try to get you answers.
And I think we'll continue to work on suggestions, you know, for example, if we know there's two paths, we could certainly even try to propose language that says, if you want to go down this path, here's some suggestions of what this might look like. If you want to go this way, here's what it might look like.
That would be helpful.
To kind of move this thing along.
That would be helpful. Okay, are there any other questions or comments from committee members or staff?
I would just say, because the Planning and Zoning Commission does handle the conditional uses, I see the last question on there, should this ordinance go through planning and zoning review? I would advocate that it go through the full commission, because there are other commissioners that, you know, frankly, pay a lot more attention to the tower cases than I do sometimes.
Yeah, I would definitely say it's my intent, and I think I said, I posted it on one of my Facebook pages last night that I intend for this whole ordinance to go through this full-blown public process. So through PNC, through the assembly, and once we have an actual, something closer to a presentable draft that we think we're gonna go with more questions answered, we'll make sure to disseminate it to the FCC too. That may be upon introduction though. But nonetheless, we'll make sure the community councils have it, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions. Okay, any other questions or comments from committee members? Okay, no, seeing no. Erica, this is probably a dumb question. We'll go to old business now. The status of the sign AO, has it been introduced yet?
No, I think we needed to do a little bit more work on it,
Okay.
which we have not done yet.
Okay, so is there anything I can do to help you with that?
Find 2 more days in the week.
Done.
I was just saying, 'cause
That
I
are not
thought-
called
I
Saturday
thought-
and Sunday.
I thought we were really, really close. I thought the only like sticky widget was the
Well,
percentage.
I missed the last meeting, but I understood we were supposed to go back and look at like how the height of projecting signs, there was that issue that we were supposed to come up with a recommendation for. Didn't that come up at the last meeting?
That's a new
Oh, that's a
issue.
new issue? I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, no, I don't know anything about that.
That's a new one.
I thought there was something raised at that meeting that we needed to
Didn't come up
go
at the
back
meeting, no.
and check on.
Came up separately.
There was, I was gonna say, from my knowledge, there was only one issue that, you know, the industry could live with the percentage, and then staff had recommended, but there may possibly be an amendment on the floor, but it was something that we didn't resolve in the committee, but that was the only thing I knew of.
Okay, I'm sorry, I
Yeah, I
misunderstood
thought we
what
were
happened
done.
at that meeting.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
thought we were pretty much done.
Oh.
The height is a separate issue that's come up since that time, but it does not need to be, I don't think it needs to be hold up the process if you feel like it
Okay.
needs to move forward. Although, if you want to do it all at once in a true omnibus fashion, then that would be fine, it just would slow us down a little bit.
Well, I think at this point, because I'm not even familiar with the issue you're talking about right now.
How high a sign can be, a projecting building sign can be from the street, basically. There's challenging height limitations, and the question the industry is asking us to evaluate is, do they impede the aesthetic appeal of these works of art that we're creating? And there was one example, a new installation, a new sign installed that really sort of illustrates the point pretty provocatively. So I think it's something that we want to consider.
Okay, so is that something that is gonna take a while, that we can,
Actually, I think it could be a relatively
Yeah,
easy
it could be
fix.
simple, yeah.
just a simple little amendment to that? Comments? Okay,
Okay.
let's include it then.
Okay.
Okay, so that one then, I'll just keep it on my tickler list, keep asking you how it's going. Just so you know. Lucky day. And then, are we good to go on November 4th for the marijuana ale, the draft?
Let's see.
The November 11th meeting's been canceled because it's a holiday. I didn't realize that.
I had promised, what's today, that's 20. So I had promised the administration a draft by, I think, the end of this month. So assuming they're happy with it, yes.
Well, then I'm gonna leave it because we're getting close on time. I mean,
Yeah,
especially
I
with,
know.
I know. I wish we could clone you, but we can't. We're gonna plan on November 4th for the,
Can you clarify the meeting schedule?
yeah. So November 4th and 18th are the only two meetings in November.
So we don't have one next
Wait.
week?
Wait. Wait. Let me look.
I thought it was the 10th and.
I'm saying the wrong date. So October.
Not the meeting, not the assembly meetings. This committee.
Yeah, so we have meetings scheduled on November 4th and November 18th. November 11th's been canceled.
And not next week either.
Yeah, not next week either. And that was because that was in response to staff saying that basically I was working too much. I'm being a little
Sorry.
pushy, yeah, so we're trying to back off a little and trying to, clump it together a little bit more succinctly. Okay?
That helps.
Yeah, so the next meeting is November 4th. So that is the meeting we'll plan on going through the marijuana draft ale. But that's the one, I mean, we really gotta get this going because it's gotta go through P&Z too. So, and then, and the tentative meeting dates are on the bottom of the agenda. All right, so with that, are there any other questions, comments, positive remarks? You notice I leave the negative right off the table. Okay, with that, we're gonna take the last few minutes of the meeting and see if there's comments from around the room. I'll start over here. Kathy, please.
Thank you. I'm heavily engaged in Turnagain Community Council. I'm the past president, and during my 3-year tenure, Verizon proposed 2 cell towers in Turnagain, and previous to that, ACS installed one at a church location. And so our council has a little bit of history with cell towers, and based on that experience, I can give you a rundown on the issues that came up, regardless of the cell tower itself and the proposal. With regard to public process, it was our first foray into that, and we found it completely lacking. So I would hope that this ordinance would do a much better job in addressing the public process. Let's see, in no particular order, it said the notices were sent to property owners within 500 feet of the proposed site. One in particular was located where there's mostly renters who live in that area. And this is, again, completely residential and turning it zoned residential. So the renters were not notified. So we felt like a necessary change is to notify not only property owners, but those who physically live within that distance.
In the new Title 21, it does that.
Okay. And now, and I'm sorry, I don't know what the new, this was when old was still.
It's all resident.
In place. And also the fact that, it was only 500 feet. And we felt like that was really pretty minimal, almost too minimal. And that it probably should be maybe 1,000 feet public notice for something like that. The posting on the actual sites in all 3 location instances said there would be an administrative hearing. But in fact, the semantics are completely wrong. There was no hearing, there never was any intention of having a hearing. It's an administrative site review.
We fixed that as well.
And so again, I'm just
Yeah,
speaking
no, I know.
on our experience back then. And then that just goes to the lack of the ability for neighbors and community council to really provide input in a meaningful way. The 2 out of the 3 that came up during the summer when our council didn't even meet. So it was a real struggle to actually have any kind of meaningful council input, engage the residents in a kind of an organized way. to Verizon's credit, it was before they were kind of established up here. They actually sent 4 people from Washington State to 2 of our community council meetings because of these towers. It was pretty impressive. But besides that, I mean, it was just really lacking with the amount of limited time we had to respond as a council, and as far as residents kind of use the council as a coalition to work on this proposal, or these proposals. So we felt like, in the end, our conclusion on the process was any residential, or any tower proposed in a residential zoned area should require a conditional use permit. And the main reason is then you have a way to actually have a hearing where you can go to PNC and make your case in a much more formal way than just have, hey, you've got 30 days to submit some comments, and then also because of the appeals requirements, property owners within that notice distance had 15 days to appeal an administrative site review, but those residents weren't notified when the decision by the administration was made. And so they completely missed the deadline. This is the one off of Wisconsin on 31st in particular. They didn't even realize they had a small window. 15 days is an incredibly small window for residents or property owners to put together a big appeal process. So that really should be extended. And I mean, just for real life purposes, and that they should, anyone who received the notice of the tower should also receive notice of when the decision is made and when the clock starts ticking on an appeal process time period. So those were the kinds of things we identified when we went through our real life cell tower processes in Kernigan.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Kathy. I'm going to try to make this go kind of quickly because we're at our stopping point now, but I still want to hear what everybody has to say. So if you could just make your comments succinct, and then if you have additional comments or suggestions, you can certainly email them to me, and I'll make sure to disseminate them to everyone. Lance. And
Yeah,
also, just state your name for the record.
I'm Lance Powell, and I just have a comment, a couple questions real quick. I'll just comment that Verizon, under the old B21, did not have to work with us. I'm with the community council. But they, to their credit, for whatever reason, they did, and they pretty much accommodated us, and that's to their credit. I would like to say that much. Also, is there anyone here that could speak to ballpark the estimate or the cost of putting in a cell phone tower?
On average, 700,000.
700,000, and then the additional cost for a cell tower?
Probably 225,000.
Okay, additional cost.
Yes.
All right, I'm done.
My name is Annette Cartier, and I live in the Rogers Park Community Council area. I will basically mirror Ms. Gleason's comments, public process comments, everything about it. And what I would like to do is propose that the residents get a compare document to the working draft right now, so we can visually see that the notices, everything she said, we can see it in the old code, and it's not been changed, or if it has been tweaked for the new changes in the code, like the compare document. That would be my first comment. Please asking for that, so make it easier on the residents, since we're going to go through the public process with this change. And the other comment that I have is on the resolution that it was the Don Jose's resolution. Rogers Park opposed the tower at Don Jose's a couple different times. It became shorter than what it was initially going to be built for. And what I believe I learned today is that that tower could now be extended with the co-location, because if there could be 2 towers in one tower in 2 locations, that could be extended. And I think that's what I learned today from the meeting, and I just want to make that note for the record, and that a new tower is $700,000, and a stealth, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is the addition on the top of the tower, is $225,000.
A cell tower is those camouflage towers. They're different types of.
Okay, all right. But right now, they can be extended, the existing towers with our new codes that you're writing today?
Part of what we heard today was, if somebody builds a tower under federal law, the city can't stop them. They can apply for one extension and get it.
Okay,
But that's federal law.
all right.
So that's what, yeah, that was part of one of the mandatory extensions. Now, there are proposals for, if there's co-location, to allow people to have a little, from the city side, to allow you to have a little taller tower. But one of the issues we're trying to work through is we know there's a mandatory, if somebody wants to make a tower taller, through the feds, they can exercise that option once. So we have to mitigate, we don't want to see 115-foot towers in residential. So that's part of the discussion, is how do we form that language to make sure that doesn't happen.
All right. Well, the key for me as a resident and time is a good compare right to compare, because I've got the old ones and the new ones, just so we're all covered.
And Dennis, can you talk for just a second about when you're reading the drafts, how you can tell what the changes are from old code?
You can't, you really can't, because what we did is we reorganized it, and so it was really, you couldn't really do inline editing, track changes, because I was moving so much stuff around. But I can create a compared document, that's not a problem. What I would do is I'd take notice, here's what notice says in the old code, here's what was being proposed,
Yeah.
height. I can certainly break it up into a separate document.
Because that would make it easy if we're all concentrating on notice, public process, height, so I would appreciate that.
And that's something we can post on our committee webpage too. So everybody's there. Go ahead.
Levine, President. It seems like one of the important things that came up today was the promotion, the mandating, the enforcement of the co-location, that we don't need cell towers everywhere. It's very obvious now with the leaves dropped that there's more than I remembered seeing earlier in the summer, and to promote the co-location, the different providers on the same tower could be great for our community.
So, Tim Feller with South Edition. So I just want to say that I'm glad you're going ahead with the process and not adopting this, because more work does need to be done. A lot of work has been done, but it all comes down to definitions. And above all, the federal government does, the FCC regulations do not completely preempt protection of our neighborhoods. You've got to have input from the neighborhoods. Resolutions are moving through community councils now that express what their wishes, how they wish their neighborhoods to be protected. Nobody, I don't think anybody will admit that they want a cell tower in their backyard overlooking their building. So we can protect against that. So we need to just move ahead with these resolutions, but we also need to work on definitions.
Thank you.
So when you talk about, my name is Racheli Feller, and I'm a member of the South Edition. And when you talk about co-location, giving them the extra 15 heights, he has already admitted that they already have their antenna on top of those. That extra 15 heights are already using it. So, if no one else is using it, they don't want to remove their antenna. They've already got that extra 15 heights, 15 feet height.
Thank you. Did you have anything else, Becky?
Nothing else. I won't keep you guys longer. Thank you for.
She said.
Teresa Arnold, South Edition. I would just reiterate what Tim said, in that the FCC grants telecommunications companies tremendous power, but they also grant local governments some power. So I wouldn't say our hands are tied by the federal government, the FCC rules. Also hearing that GCI, Verizon, and AT&T are actually working together, I would respectfully ask that maybe they pool some of their profits and put in some of these small cells in neighborhoods, because the antenna array in residential areas, it's quite frankly and respectfully, it's unacceptable. So.
Heather, do you have anything?
Yeah, Heather Nolan, South Edition resident. I wrote down some bullet points. I'll just read them and keep it brief. Again, I really appreciate being invited to this and being part of the process. It's still a bummer that it's during the day. Some of us get paid to be here. Some of us, you all know these. I'm sure we're not the first people to say it. I'm wondering if, again, we kind of discussed decision trees, but to keep things more simplified, would it be easier to start with the zoning and then build the criteria out per zoning? I of seeing the pieces come together of how we could maybe do that, but, you know, I would imagine that engineering background, that's a kind of a starting point. Would also like to see, like Teresa mentioned, the definitions added of small cell technology. That's actually in this last Federal Register that's being referred to constantly about the height changes and the substantial height changes of 10% versus 20 feet. It's in here mentioned a lot, so I would like to see maybe some of that definition brought into it. And then I'd also like to know when there are questions about whether it's a federal regulation or an FCC code issue, who's taking that action item to actually validate whether that is, instead of hearing that being thrown out like, well, that might be a federal violation or that might be a federal code issue, who's actually taking those action items to follow up and see if these criteria that we're all proposing to try and come up to a better place, who's following up with that? And that was my last bullet point.
Good comments, thank you. Sir, did you have any comments?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right, well, thank you all for coming. We will see you on November 4th.